Thank you all for coming today. Dr. Albertini has done research on this topic, original research. So this is not just a reflection on other texts, but primary research. And today she will be, as the title suggests, exploring a contemporary personal response to the philosophical dilemma of evil and the Shoah or the Holocaust. As you know, there are several different terms we use. I think you all know her status, but just in case you do not, she's a wonderful colleague who is the chair now of the philosophy department, and chair of any department certainly takes a great amount of patience, the politics perhaps of Benjamin Disraeli, to manage this. And she is also obviously a full professor, publisher, speaker, etc., on a variety of topics. As I said before the taping, but certainly worthy of repeating, she's the kind of colleague we all wish we always had, as well as her lovely husband, who I miss. I hope George is in good health. Okay, so let me turn it over. Tamara would like to record, and I hope that is okay with everybody that's being recorded. And then if you have questions that are immediately pertinent to what Dr. Albertini is talking about, please ask if that's okay. If there are questions that don't require immediate answering, if you could please put in the chat, and we have plenty of time at the end to get to those. Okay, so thank you all very much for joining us. I hope you are all healthy and keeping proper distance and safety. Dr. Albertini.
Thank you, Peter. Before I start, I would like to introduce two of our consuls. The state of Hawaii has a consular board, not everybody knows that. And considering the biography of Hans-Jörg Alfred Salmony, I thought, who was born in Köln in Germany and then ended up during the war in Switzerland, I thought it would be really a good thing to have them say a few words. I was wondering, so who should go first? Then I thought, let's just chronology decide this. I'll ask Dennis to say a few words because Salmony's journey started in Germany. And then Teres will then follow. Yeah, so Dennis, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Tamara, and I hope everybody can hear me okay. I'm Dennis Sali. I'm the Honorary Consul for Germany here in Hawaii. And I'm more than honored that Tamara asked me to say a few words. And I tried to read into this rather unknown philosopher and try to find out as much as I could. And think, what could I say about that since I'm not a philosopher, and what could I say that doesn't sound completely ridiculous? It does evoke in me, a lot of memories of my many, many years of trying to understand the Nazi regime and trying to understand how all this came about. And I think when you look at somebody like Salmony and his contemporaries, I think they were really all doing the same thing. They were trying to understand how that degree of evil could have come among or upon humankind. How could they rationalize the complete destruction of society in the matter of a few years? And I think Salmony himself was so affected. He lost his parents. He had to flee. He probably missed death a couple of times during his attempts to get away from the Nazis. That must have deeply affected his thoughts. And I think when you talk about him, that's what I'm going to try to read. I'm trying to find out in how far did his personal experience affect his philosophy and his thoughts on society. And so I'm very glad that you brought this guy to light, and I understand from your website that you are a scholar of his. Is that correct? So that's quite amazing, and I'm glad that we're all going to have a chance to learn a little bit about this man. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. Terence?
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for the invitation. That is very kind of you. I really look forward to. I do have to admit also, I did not know, or I do not know, Hans-Jörg Salmony, other than he was a philosopher and a Holocaust refugee. And I have to agree with Dennis. I look very much forward to how his feelings were around that time. As for Switzerland, during the Second World War, Switzerland stayed neutral and was very little affected by the war, by the physical war. And so many refugees were seeking safe haven in Switzerland. Altogether, roughly 300,000 refugees came to Switzerland, entered the borders from Nazi-occupied countries. But unfortunately, as we all know, this was definitely not enough. And unfortunately, like so many other countries did and still do, Switzerland closed the borders to the refugees and turned them away and sent them into whatever misery they had to go. Luckily for Hans-Jörg Salmony, he was one of the lucky ones. He could stay, and he found a safe haven in Switzerland. And so we are now fortunate to hear through Tamara about his valuable body of work. And I'm looking very much forward to the lecture by our very own highly accomplished Swiss philosopher and professor, Tamara Albertini. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Teres. Thank you, Dennis. I finally found out how to do this, to get a page of the lecture on evil and use it here on my first slide. That way you get a sense of the condition of the text. Hans-Jörg Alfred Salmony has about 40 lectures that are all typed. He typed them himself. And as you can tell, over the years, he changed things here and there. Something he typed things in. Sometimes he, hand wrote whatever additions. So it's not too bad to work with this kind of text. But there are challenges with any text that was not given its final revision by the author. I'm hoping very much to publish this, and maybe in time some other lectures as well. But let's just start with one. Let's just focus on this one lecture. In the title, I say Holocaust escapee. You see, people know me as someone who does work in Islamic philosophy and Renaissance philosophy, but not necessarily in 20th century philosophy. And I'm definitely not a Holocaust expert. So I had to really educate myself. And one of the things I found out early on is that there is a debate of sorts in the Jewish community, maybe more in Israel than in other countries, which has to do who can call himself or herself a Holocaust survivor. So I found out that some people draw a very fine line and say that in order to qualify as a Holocaust survivor, you need to have been in a extermination camp. Mm-hmm. And if you were only affected in the sense that you had to run, that you had to find safe haven somewhere, then you could call yourself a Holocaust escapee. I'm definitely not going to interfere in this kind of conversation. So when I saw that, I understood quite clearly that Professor Salmony is a Holocaust escapee. So just wanted to, get the terminology right. Last year was the 100th anniversary of his birth. And Peter may remember that. Peter Hoffenberg, who is hosting this event today, may remember that originally the plan was to give this talk in the year of his 100th anniversary. I'd like to just share very quickly with you what we did in commemoration of that 100th anniversary. So this is part of the website that I started in 2015. I must say I wasn't too ambitious. I only felt that the basic information should be put out. And but in time, as I got more and more information from the family of my teacher, Professor Salmony, and also from researching in various libraries in Europe, I understood that there is so much more that I like to share with the public here. But at this point, just the item here, recollections from former pupils. So Thomas Schmidt, I'll talk to him in a moment, is a graduate student in our program. He helped me design this. And so, and contact the people I knew had once been Professor Moni's students. And to my delight, we found a professor in Korea who a very long time ago had been a student of Salmony and is now himself a retired professor of philosophy. And you can see, hopefully, the poem. It's in Korean. You know, we have a very diverse department. It was not too hard to find a graduate student from Korea to translate this. I won't spend more time on this. You're very welcome to look it up. It's easy to find. All you need to do is type "a philosopher from Basel," "a philosopher from Basel." As the two consuls pointed out, there wasn't a lot more information available online. So if you just type Hans-Jörg Alfred Salmony, well, you'll find the website at some point, but not right away. But "a philosopher from Basel" will get you straight there. the only competition is Nietzsche, and I knew that, so I played a little trick here. Yeah. But back to the PowerPoint, and that's where we'll continue. I do have many words of thanks. Of course, Peter Hoffenberg, who invited me to give this talk, I like really to recognize. He's been a supporter of this project for many years now. I mean, you know, just to know that I could ask him questions felt very good already. And trust me, he did more than that. Other people I like to mention is, of course, the family Salmony. There is Claude and Michelle. These are the children of my teacher, Claude and Marina, his wife Marina Salmony. I like to thank Michelle Salmony Di Stefano and her husband Giovanni Di Stefano. It felt good every time I went to Basel to know I could stop by, we could talk about the project, they would share things with me. On occasion, I get a picture or some other information that's obviously only available in the family, and I really appreciated their trust. I do have two sponsors. I'm not sure if my first sponsor is among you in the virtual room. Do we have Ruth Kleinfeld? I got in touch with someone. She is at Kahalanui, and I asked someone at Kahalanui to help her out with an iPad. So I tried to find her name, but I couldn't. So I hope she's somewhere in here. And I definitely like to thank her. It is to her generous gift that I was able to travel to Basel 3 times to meet the family and also do some research at the university library there. And then I have a second sponsor who wishes to remain anonymous, and I'll respect that. This person too was extremely helpful and you know, helped me finance these 3 trips to Basel. I mentioned the University Library in Basel, an amazing place to do research. The librarians have been extremely helpful. Of course, when I got there and explained what it is that I was interested in, they said I could see the documents they have, mostly letters, but also reports. But publishing is another matter. So I suppose this can be different from country to country. You need to be sure that the family of the person who, let's say, wrote letters and that the family of the addressee of those letters both agree for the publication of any such documents, and that's fine. I'll certainly wait until that is done. And I also got in touch with the Deutsche Nationalbibliothek. They have a smaller section dedicated to German exile literature. They too were extraordinarily helpful. I like to recognize Thomas Schmidt. I mentioned him a little bit earlier before. I know he's in the audience, PhD candidate, like I said. He helped me get in touch with former students of Salmony and also with some technicalities relating to the website. And I have one more person to thank. That's my son, Peter Wolf Vasilev. The parents among you will know that we belong to a generation that needs help from their children. I would never have started the website without Peter. So I like to thank him very much in that regard. Now, time to start to talk about Salmony. So I chose these two pictures because usually when you hear about someone who is a philosopher, you imagine a much older person. Salmony's children were kind enough to let me have a passport picture of their father from 1949. Obviously, accomplished people have not always been old. And more importantly, in this case, the story that I like to tell you, and that is the philosophical journey of Hans-Georg Salmony, started when he was very young. And I think you already know the circumstances. It all started with him being out among all nights during the Reichskristallnacht. Some of you may know it as the night of the broken glasses. But in German, it's the Kristallnacht. So that's the night of November 9th to November 10th. He was 18 years old, and you can imagine what kind of impact it must have made on him to see the destruction of Jewish property, but then more so the attacks on individual Jews or whoever looked like he or she might be Jewish. He understood things were not going to get better. He was his native city of Cologne, Köln in German, and decided that he would leave the country in the same year. So we're talking here November, right? November 1938. The first time he tried, it didn't work out. The second time, his father helped him, and they were both. So Salmony was able to leave the country. He left. So at the end of 1938, and went to Belgium. Switzerland is a neutral country. Some people may forget that Belgium too was a neutral country. He had hoped to be safe there, started to study, but it didn't take long until the German army marched in May 1940. And then something very bizarre happened. Bizarre probably because I wasn't able to get more information. So he and thousands more of Jews in Belgium were put on a refugee train to southern France. And it's not clear who organized the train. Why did they need to leave? Sometimes I read that there were that Jews in Belgium and also later in France were considered a risk because of their nationality, because they were Germans. So it looks like you could never get it right. Either you had to leave because you were Jewish, or you had to leave because you were German. So very, very bizarre. But then, of course, the saddest part about all this is that Salmony has never seen his parents again. He has left Cologne at the end of 1938, and that was the last time he has been able to be with them. Now, extraordinarily, I find is that Köln has this center for National Socialism, socialist documentation, NS Dokumentationszentrum. And among many, many things that they did, they created a dépliant, a leaflet. So you're looking here at the one side of the leaflet, and then as you flip it, you'll see on the upper left corner a postcard that has never been delivered. I think I can just open up a little bit here. Yes, so that you can see the name Claude Salmony. So this is Professor Salmony's son who gave this postcard to be included in the exhibition. You see in the picture Salmony's parents, and if you compare now the pictures of Salmony's mother on the left. These are the happy times. This is before National Socialism came to power, I assume. And then you look at her picture on the ID card she was given once she was deported, and you can tell that this is not anymore the same person. Yeah. On the left, I see a woman who is self-confident, who feels safe. Look at the body language between her and her husband. And then, of course, no need to say any more about the other picture. And what I think is amazing is that there is so much information available about single detainees. So here you can find out that Tekla, her name was Tekla Salmony, was a piano player. So somebody I imagine very tender with, long fingers. And then, she had to work in a factory and didn't survive very long. Then what I thought was extraordinary is that Köln, and apparently more cities, not just in Germany, in Poland too, I hear, created what they call stumbling stones. So here you see the name of Salmony's father, and underneath is the name of his mother. And if you click here, you'll see exactly where they were placed, namely in front of the house that used to be the family home. Can you see this? Can you see that? No? Can you see this? Okay. And then, so I'll just click once on one name here. And it's rather amazing. You can see the home, the family home. And then you'll see where those stumbling stones have been placed. So I thought that was a brilliant idea. I mean, the people may not be there, but at least you'll have their names. Yeah. So I thought that was a brilliant idea, and I hope more cities in Europe will do that. So back to Salmony, a little bit, information, on the timeline. So he, if you remember, he left Köln during the Reichskristallnacht. He went to Belgium, thought he would be safe there, was put on a refugee train and found himself in southern France. Why southern France? Why so many camps in southern France? So apparently France was getting ready for refugees of the civil war in Spain. So that's why they were in southern France and usually in the vicinity of the Spanish border. So he ended up in a camp called Saint-Cyprien. And you can follow what happens afterwards. So he gets there in May 1940, and in June 1940, he's already in Switzerland. So he didn't stay there too long. And I'll show you just two pictures relating to Camp Saint-Cyprien. You see here people on the beach. I mean, it's not like there was an actual barrack or a house or any real shelter, maybe for some, but not for everyone. So people would just camp out on the beach. Today, it's a beautiful resort, right? But in the early 40s, this was the place where there was a camp. I found out that nearly 5,000 Jews were expelled from Belgium, and they all went to Saint-Cyprien, so that determined the choice. And on the right, you see a painting by Felix Nussbaum. He was also there in that same camp, and of course, you'll recognize the barbed wires, giving you a sense of what it must have been to be there. However, having said that, the fact that Salmony and many other of the internees there were able to escape suggests that the guards were not too obsessed about keeping them in the camp. So this is not the same as an extermination camp in Poland. But still, I mean, there is no way that this would have been a pleasant experience for anyone. And interestingly, years later, when he was already settled in Basel in Switzerland, he met two people who were also in southern French camps. One is the very famous Hannah Arendt. I'm sure many of you know her. Not just the author of The Origins of Totalitarianism, The Human Condition, but also of a book that is more widely known, Eichmann in Jerusalem.
She was a former student of Karl Jaspers. And so when Jaspers received the call to teach in Basel, so she would come to visit on occasion. And that's how Salmony met her. He was, of course, a much, much younger fellow at that time. And another person who he met in Basel later, and I'd like you to see her picture because she was quite cute, is Gertrude Isolani. She, while Hannah Arendt found papers to exit the camp legally, Gertrude Isolani just marched out. She was there with her daughter. She was the author of a great number of books, novels, poems, and such. The book that made her most famous was Stadt ohne Männer, City Without Men. So she was looking at a women's society in a camp like Camp de Gure, and gave and shared quite intriguing insights about what happens when people are taken out of their usual surroundings. But back to Salmony. So he entered Switzerland in June 1940. What it really meant is that he found a way near Geneva to enter the country illegally. And apparently, if you did that, you had a much better chance of remaining in Switzerland. So had he shown at the border, he would have probably been sent away. But since he was already on Swiss soil, so he was able to stay. What it meant in the beginning for him is that he lived in different camps for about 2 years. And I found information about one camp, which is Camp d'Avesco. Today, it's just part of Lugano in the south of Switzerland, the Italian-speaking part of Switzerland. Back then, apparently, d'Avesco was a independent municipality. So if you go down here, you look at number 10, it's d'Avesco near Lugano. It's extraordinary the kind of information you can find on the internet nowadays. So this was put together by the American Jewish Congress in 1944. I suppose they've done that for many European countries, not just for Switzerland, but I was amazed at the information. Like in this case, you had the name, you had the number of Jewish or Gentile detainees, as in this other camp here. It was very, very precise. They would also tell you what kind of work people were doing in those camps. I could tell that they were separating Jews and Gentiles according to age and gender, like Orthodox Jews all in one camp. I suppose that did make sense. Camps for women, for pregnant women, for families. It is rather amazing. And I found out that Switzerland had over 500,000 refugees and internees. Over 100,000 were actually soldiers from various armies, including Americans and Canadians and such, who would fly over Switzerland and be shut down. Yeah. So anyway, the more I look into this, every time I go to Basel, I come home with some more pieces of the puzzle. Just a few passages before we talk about the lecture on evil. A few passages I found in letters that Salmony wrote to, in particular, two individuals whom he highly respected and considered them as mentors. He's usually very discreet about his experience on the run, the things that happened to him, how he felt about them. But here in the letter to Heinrich Barth, I do see, a passage. It's a very long passage, so I'm just paraphrasing here. Few words quickly about Heinrich Barth. Some people may think Karl Barth, yes, they were brothers. One was a philosopher, the other one a theologian. Heinrich Barth was really a good mentor to Salmony. And this is what Salmony writes to him in 1958. So this is quite a bit after the end of the war. He reminisces about a night in June 1942 when he was in the camp of d'Avesco. He was on night watch. Apparently, the internees were taking turns, kind of like, making sure nobody enters the camp who shouldn't be in and so forth. And then he also, he had this eerie feeling and of abandonment, kind of like, what am I doing here, right? I mean, anybody would have that strange sense of alienation And then he also reveals that just a day earlier, a young man in that camp had committed suicide. Somebody had spread the rumors that the Germans were going to march into Switzerland, and he did not want to be captured. So he just decided he would end his life. So even if you were already in Switzerland, not everybody thought that it would be permanently a safe haven. In another letter to Heinrich Barth, in my translation here, he says, when I feel bad, this is still 1958, when I feel bad, I like to escape to memories of emigration. Not escape from memories of emigration. And I'm sure he had those moments too, but escape to memories of emigration. Why? Because despite all the misery, it was the time of hope for a better world. So think about this for a moment. So while he was an emigrant, he was in a very bad spot, but he had hopes that it might become better. So 1958, he feels that there is no hope. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that Salmony always felt like that and kept feeling like that for many, many more years, but still, it's quite revealing that in that moment, at least in the moment when he wrote the letter, he didn't think there was hope for change. And the other mentor is Fritz Lieb. Fritz Lieb is the kind of person that you just would love to have met. Of course, you look at his dates, he was much older than Salmony. Among all the people Salmony corresponded with, or I should say, among all the letters that I found of people who corresponded with him, Fritz Lieb is the only one whom Salmony calls a friend and uses the du form. You know, German has the politeness and the kind of like more casual form, so it's du or sie. He's the only one who gets the du. This is 1962. He writes to Fritz Lieb, who was a Swiss Reformed theologian, an Orientalist, a Slavist. I mean, he was a monumental figure of scholarship. He writes to him, your friendship has guided me surely through the plight of abysmal situations. And even before we got to know each other personally, your courage, your unwavering bravery, and your advocacy for what you recognized as right in the worst times of Nazism were for me a source of hope and strength. You see, Fritz Lieb was teaching in Bonn from 1930 till 1933. And in his lectures, he was not exactly neutral, as you know, he should have been as being a Swiss. He definitely expressed his dislike for National Socialism on a regular basis. And sure enough, when the Nazis came to power in 1933, Fritz Lieb lost his job. Now you would think he would have gone to Switzerland. No, instead he went to Paris and started a free German academy and started to publish a journal. I mean, he was really an activist. I don't think the word existed back then, but that's really what Fritz Lieb was. And that's why Salmony had such great appreciation for him, because in a time when a few people spoke out, Fritz Lieb was really the exception. What I see in this kind of sharing of rather personal sentiments is that Salmony was obviously more comfortable talking to people who have had some more exposure or personal exposure to Germany during National Socialism. Heinrich Barth was not himself in Germany, but his brother, the more famous Karl Barth, was supposedly the only professor in Germany who refused to swear an oath of allegiance to Hitler. And so, of course, he had to leave and he got back to Basel. Fritz Lieb, you just heard his story. And the third person, you'll get his name very, very soon. I mean, you heard it actually, Karl Jaspers. I said Hannah Arendt had been a student of Karl Jaspers. Karl Jaspers had lived through National Socialism in Germany. And he was the third mentor with whom Salmony could talk about things that matter to him on a more personal level. But yes, let's talk about that lecture on evil. What I found the first time I went to see my teacher's family is that Claude, his son Claude Salmony, had taken care of his father's unpublished materials. He put them in archival boxes. Everything was marked and labeled. And the one lecture he shared early on with me is the one on evil. So I've made it a little bit larger here for you. This way you can see the details. So in German, of course, das philosophische Problem des Bösen, the philosophical problem of evil. And Salmony wrote there, 91 pages, 10 hours. You see, for the students present right now, you should know that in the German system of education, which was not just in Germany, but also in Austria and in Switzerland, and I trust it's still like that today. There were two types of courses. One, the seminar style, and one where the professor would read, literally, just read off a manuscript. So Salmony knew exactly, that these 91 pages would last for 10 hours. He repeated this lecture 5 times in his career. The first time he wrote it was in 1964, and then it's basically between 5 and 7 years, increments of 5 to 7 years that he repeated the lecture. And I'm sure every time he did repeat it, he made some slight changes to it. Something that was very typical for Salmony is that it was very important to him that the lines between theology and philosophy not be blurred. So, for instance, right in the beginning of the lecture on evil, he would point out 3 essential differences between these two disciplines. Philosophy does not trade in apodictic dogmatic answers. That is very, very clear from the lecture, and it's something that I heard him say many times in his courses. Second, philosophy asks about the nature. The German has Wesen, which also translates as essence, but I was more comfortable with nature as a translation. Philosophy asks about the nature of evil, and now a quotation in translation. Philosophie is female in German. Nouns are gendered in German. She shifts the problem from transcendence to immanence, from the beyond of the Godhead to the here and now of our world and of every human being. Salmony didn't want to go to big principles, right? Anything that's a beyond. No. When it comes to evil, right? Philosophy looks at the present and looks at the individual level. And then he says, it is philosophy that attempts to defend God, not theology. This may surprise you. Maybe you would expect it to be the other way around. He says the pious has no need of an apology. The word is theodicy, right? So what theology does instead is justify faith, not God. Yeah? Very, very, very clear, the distinction he makes here. And then finally he says the philosophical problem, right? This is really what he wants to do, examine the philosophical problem of evil. That is a part of the genre of theodicy. This is what philosophy does. So this is kind of like just preparation. The other part actually, that is very important to get right in the beginning are the 2 terms in German, das Übel and das Böse. They both translate as evil. And in English, it's context that will help you figure out, the difference in meaning. But German has conveniently these 2 terms. Just, to keep it simple in the beginning here, das Böse could also means wicked, right? And is also the opposite of the good, but not das Übel, right? Das Übel could be due to a cataclysm, right? Where people get hurt and harmed, right? That is not the same as das Böse. Salmony says das Übel is the general term, and das Böse is the subterm. And the technical meaning is moral evil. So das Böse is the moral evil. And here is a passage I translated. Insofar as the moral evil is a matter of an active subject, it's getting a little bit complex here. Das Übel is not a subjective, but an objective phenomenon. What he wants to say is, when it comes to das Böse, the moral evil, that is something that has to do with the perspective that you take of the perpetrator. Das Übel is on the receiving end. And then he says the localization of Übel in the object and of the moral evil in the subject means Übel is what we encounter, what happens to us, that which occurs. Moral evil, on the other hand, is a doing or a perpetrator. Here is just a problem I mentioned. We'll get back to it at the end of the lecture. That which is morally reprehensible, says Salmony, changes over time. It's culturally, religiously, historically determined. So how to define it? And can it be defined at all? So we'll get back to that question a little bit later. Another thing he does bring in, of course, major authorities of Western philosophy, like Leibniz, who also gave much attention to evil. He became particularly famous for his theodicy, for his defense of God. Leibniz makes a difference between metaphysical evil, physical evil, and moral evil. That's not the route that Salmony chose. He was inspired by Karl Jaspers, and Jaspers being an existential or having been an existential philosopher, you would expect evil would be then addressed as an existential problem, right? And that is pretty much the route that Salmony takes as well in his lecture on evil. Jaspers has a term that encompasses both Übel and Böse. In German, it's Unheil, translates, I think, correctly as calamity. It's very helpful to, look at the distinction that Jaspers made. So Übel is something you would find in the domain of nature, cataclysmic event, right? Das Böse pertains to the human realm. In the case of nature, das Übel is a matter of blind necessity. I mean, nature doesn't mean to hit someone in particular. It's whoever and whatever is on its way. Think of lava flow, right? Nature does not decide that it's going to destroy a particular home, right? And so what Jaspers does then for Das Böse, he speaks of seeing freedom, sehende Freiheit, right? Necessity is blind, freedom sees. And then just to continue very quickly on the side of Übel, so people who are interested in that domain, so see God as breaking the chain of causality, and that would be a matter of miracles. Salmony is not going that route at all. For him, it's not about good and it's not about evil, right? This is something that's happening in nature, a matter of blind necessity. And what comes next is a very long portion of the lecture in which Salmony discusses various forms of determinism. At first, one is not too clear why that is, but you'll see, just bear with me, that it's the way he found to actually discover his own position. So commonly one thinks of a theological determinism, I think most of us have heard that. It could be predestination, so God, decides everything from all eternity. It could be a matter of fatalism, everything is governed by blind necessity. But then there are, other forms of determinism. He speaks of a scientific one, causal, mechanistic, an ethical, anthropological, where there may be both inner and outer causes. He speaks of a psychological determinism, where psychological events govern actions. And then very briefly, just one paragraph that puzzled me and still puzzles me. He speaks of pseudo-biological, ethnic, and sociological determinism. You see, in the German, the word for ethnic that he uses is völkisch. And so I was wondering whether that was a hint at National Socialist doctrine, right? He doesn't speak about National Socialism in his lecture, and that may surprise you, but that was the style of Hans-Jörg Salmony. So what he's really interested in philosophically is indeterminism, which he sees to be the basis of freedom. And he says there's no concern with world events here, nor with nature. Right? This is a very, very different position to have in philosophy. And I translate a few sentences here. Rather, it is concerned with a completely other in man, in the human being, the completely other, which is freedom. Indeterminism wants to save precisely this freedom. Indeterminism is the doctrine that there is a human and only human event that is not consistently causally determined, is not generated by anything else, and is consequently a causeless event from which the complete freedom of will of the naturally healthy person can be inferred. This is really where he wanted to be philosophically, right? A worldview where there is no determinations. He gives two examples for indeterminism, and I think you'll enjoy them. One is the negative saint, and the other one is humor. Humor. This is someone who writes about evil. You know a little bit about his biography, and he ends up talking about humor. Remarkable. The first form of indetermination or indeterminism that he talks about is the figure of Don Juan. We know Don Juan, Don Giovanni, right? From Mozart's opera, but we may not know that long before the opera was composed, there was a text that was very popular in Spain in the 17th century, translates as The Trickster of Seville and the Stone Guest. That is the translation of the original title. It is about sexual depravity. It is about sin. People were shocked to even listen to some of the dialogues in that text. It inspired plenty of French, Italian, and German theater plays, and of course, the most famous ones are Molière's and Mozart's adaptations. So what Salmony does with Don Juan is to say that Don Juan, in that tradition, is the embodiment of free will. This is not something you would expect, right? Don Juan is the embodiment of free will. Well, of free will's turn to evil, which makes him a negative saint. Salmony says his will to evil. The philosophers among you will feel reminded very quickly of the will to power, right? Nietzsche's will to power. But see, this is how Salmony phrases. His will, Don Juan's will to evil, forces upon him the insane fate of the eternal recurrence of the same. This too is a notion we are usually familiar with in a context involving Nietzsche, right? The eternal recurrence of the same. And what is the same? He is condemned to everlasting dissatisfaction, to bleakly unhappy eroticism. He is not doing it for the pleasure, chasing women all over Europe. He is doing it to assure himself that he is in charge of his destiny. Yeah, kind of like entirely unexpected interpretation here. The first one, so Don Juan, obviously a fictional character, but then Salmony also discusses someone who was a historic figure, and this is the famous French poet, Charles Baudelaire. In his case, Salmony speaks of a pathological indeterminism. Some of you may know his collection of poems in French, Les Fleurs du Mal, The Flowers of Evil. Now, remember, Salmony's lecture is 91 pages long. 9 pages analyze Charles de Baudelaire. It's very interesting. The poems speak of Baudelaire's attraction to dirt, depravity, and sickness. And here are a few verses that Salmony quotes in his lecture, of course in French and with his own German translation. Beside a monstrous Jewish whore I lay. One night we were two corpses side by side, and came to dream beside this hired bride of beauty my desire had turned away. It's I'll spare you more verses. It's hard to read. Just quickly about his another poem, a very long one, The Litanies of Satan. In there, he repeats, Baudelaire repeats 15 times, Satan, have pity on my long despair. Yeah? So gives you a sense of that life. Now, Salmony, of course, is interested in what this says about determinism or indeterminism. And he says Baudelaire chose moral evil, but also guilt and pain to escape determinism. So Baudelaire did not do it because he enjoyed it, right? He thought that that was the only way to have any control over his life. And then Salmony writes, determinism is reassuring. Who thinks causally acts causally. Salmony is not a determinist, but he tries to understand what's attractive about it. The thought that we are a well-assembled wheel system that can be controlled with a few simple steps is reassuring. Baudelaire knows that springs and levers have nothing to say in his case. There is neither cause nor effect. Against what he will be tomorrow, he is unable to do anything today. He's free. And that means that he, Baudelaire, cannot find refuge from his freedom either in himself or in the outside world. It's a very powerful analysis. And then the text moves on, and it's very clear. Salmony says, moral evil has solely, only its origin in freedom. And now listen to this. Only insofar and inasmuch as indeterminism is assumed, can one speak of evil at all. And he means das Böse, right? The moral evil. For only that which comes from freedom, what happens on the basis of free choice, only that which arises from a freely willed decision can be called bad or good. So again, this is the most devastating event in his life and in the 20th century, right? The evil that came with National Socialism. And yet, Salmony looks at it with the eyes of the philosopher, and he says, well, what this says is something about freedom, yeah? Extraordinary. And the other example, so humor. So one is kind of like the, the fictional and the actual character who are, who live their lives as negative saints. So humor is his next example, and it is not less, surprising than what he says about the negative saint. Traditionally, humor was part of aesthetics, and now here is where Salmony, in a way, already brings in humor. He says, yeah, but then, you look at someone called Fisher. This was a very important author in aesthetics. And then you learn the humorist always is a metaphysician. This is a joke for us philosophers. Maybe it's not too funny if you're not a philosopher. I'll spare you the many sources he looks at that give any attention, philosophical attention to humor. Just Kierkegaard. Søren Kierkegaard, also very important for existential philosophy, Danish philosopher. Humor is the confinium, the boundary between the ethical and the religious. Humor is the borderland in which both the ethical and the religious live next to each other. It's beautifully said. The borderland, humor is the borderland. And then, Kierkegaard goes on and talks about religious communities with no humor, and obviously that's not a good thing. But let's hear Salmony's take. There is a term he uses in German that's hard to translate, or at least I haven't found a good equivalent. He speaks of Lebensverfassung, so I translate that as constitution of life. Humor is a constitution of life based on freedom. This constitution of life sees through the inadequacy and weaknesses of existence, its ruthlessness, its calamity, sees through the evil and the moral evil, but stands above it, understands and lovingly forgives, lovingly forgives. This denotes the contrast between humor and irony, sarcasm, and cynicism. It's kind of like amazing, right? That someone with his biography would say, this kind of Lebensverfassung, right, constitution of life, it sees through all of that stuff, yeah? And yet, it stands above it, it understands it, and lovingly forgives, lovingly forgives. Then he distinguishes between humor and wit. Wit does not need, humor does not need wit. And wit is the weapon of the unfree. Rather remarkable distinction. Of humor, he says that it expresses a smiling yes to its milieu. And therefore it thrives when it uses dialects, Mundart, he says in German, rather than literary languages. Um, and then, believe it or not, there are many pages where he speaks of the kind of humor of his native city of Köln. Kölsch is the adjective, right? So you may know the beer, so it's the same thing. And so he mentions on and on samples of Kölsch humor. I can't read it because I don't do Kölsch. I could do Swiss German. Therese can attest to that. But I don't know how to pronounce properly in Kölsch. And you know, a detail like that tells you that despite everything, he remained attached to his native city of Köln. It was hard for him to cross into Germany when he lived in Basel. But I think he's always had a soft spot for Köln. And then one more sentence here. It is the freedom that even in the distress caused by evil and moral evil will not have you lose your serenity, will not have you lose your serenity. So horrible things can happen to you and around you. But if you have acquired this sense of freedom through humor, in a way you're safe. And yet, and here we come to the tougher issue, and I promise you I'm coming to an end of this presentation very soon. And yet, so we found out indirectly, right, that Salmony is telling us about how he coped with the tragedy that struck him and his family. He found it in humor. But how about the question of evil in a more general way, right? It's one thing to say for you as an individual that you learn how to smile and lovingly forgive, but you still have to address, if you're a philosopher, the question of the origin of evil. And what Salmony does in the last 30 pages or so of his lecture is discuss the many theories that philosophers long before him have offered. And one, of course, is particularly famous in Augustine and many more, which has to do with looking at evil as a lack of being. It's kind of like creation is still moving, it's still in progress, right? And so it's not perfect. And that's what looks to us like evil. Yes, but evil hurts, evil destroys. And so Salmony is very clear that evil is real. One should also not look into, into kind of like religious metaphors. Of course, if you are religious, then it's not a metaphor. So don't think of evil as a demonic force, a devil of sorts. And also don't think of it as hereditary sin, right? Something that the Bible says has come down to us because of the horrible error that Adam and Eve had committed while they were in the Garden of Eden. It's not about hereditary sin. In this case, Salmony follows Kant, famous Kant. And he says, the processes of which the Bible tells are repeated in every person. What happened to Adam and Eve is not unique to them. Every generation goes through the same. We all break the moral law on a daily basis, just as Adam violated the Lord's prohibition. Except that our sin is not a temporal event. It's not about something that happens in time. It's an intelligible act. And I'll try to explain that. So what is evil? Here, Jasper's Salmony brings in a little bit of Jasper's philosophy. Remember, Jaspers came to teach in Basel after World War II, and Salmony was the assistant in the institutes, and Jaspers became a very good mentor for him. Jaspers writes, evil is a tremendous, perhaps overwhelming force in destructive combat. This evil, das Böse, is will. See? So It's not about the personification of evil. It's not about hereditary sin. So what is it? What is it? Where does it come from? Jaspers is very clear. It's the will. A will detached, standing on itself and directed against reason is the powerful adversary in itself. A hatred that nourishes itself and is not a passing shadow of love. Not a passing shadow of love. And then Salmony says, well, the same is true of the good. And here he brings in Kant. Kant wrote, it is impossible to think of anything at all in the world, or indeed even beyond it, that could be considered good without limitation, except a good will. So whether it's about evil, as böse, or the good, you have to scrutinize the will. It's in the will. And then the next question is, well, how do you direct it? I mean, how do you make sure you don't choose evil over the good? Now, remember, a while ago, I said that we will have to talk about what is morally reprehensible, well, or acceptable, and how it is determined culturally, religiously, and historically. So how do you go about it? Laws, customs, prohibitions, rules, injunctions, we know that they change over time. They change sometimes within one and the same generation. And Salmony says, our moral behavior becomes clear to us only in the awareness of the law that we obey. This law brings a necessity in everything we do. So he means the moral law. This is not about, civil law or anything like that, or criminal law, right? This is the moral law. This law brings a necessity in everything we do. And then here again, he invokes Kant. So he goes between the two authorities, Kant and Jaspers. He uses them, he gets inspired by them, but you'll see he'll end up with his own position. We philosophers engage previous authors, older texts, searching to find out what exactly, where do we stand? Where is our answer vis-a-vis a question? So Salmony is obviously doing what every philosopher has always done. So he looks at Kant, and what he's interested in Kant is to find that this law, this moral law, is only something you can achieve by focusing on the form, not the content. It sounds so easy. Yeah, right, of course. The content is what changes, but the form doesn't. And here, and I promise this is the last kind of like harder bit maybe if you are not, if you haven't studied philosophy. So what Kant calls the categorical imperative. This is something that's unconditioned, an unconditional moral obligation. It is binding, no matter what, in every circumstance. It is not depending on a person's inclination, something a person does like anyway, or finds anyway reprehensible, right? It needs to be above the individual level, and also purpose is part of that. And this is where Salmony ends his inquiry. So there's this dialogue, mostly with Kant and Jaspers at the end of his lecture. And so yes, categorical imperative, right? Something that is unconditional, that is valid, no matter what the circumstances and so forth. But see what Salmony asks. What world would I create through my actions if it were within my power? It's kind of like nice. What world would I create through my actions if it were within my power? And this is the answer. And it says so much about his philosophy. Listen to this, it's amazing. What the world actually is, I only learn through what I do myself. I don't know what the world is, right? It doesn't mean the world as you can approach it scientifically. It's not about that. It is as if the world has not yet been decided. See, all the possibilities are open. Rather, as if through what I do, with the reality of what I do, I still help to decide what it is. By what I am and what I do, I convince myself of what is possible and what is real in the world. It's amazing, right? And if you go back to the discussion we had about determinism and indeterminism, right? What it is Salmony has found his own corner, right? His own niche, if you will, of how to become an indeterminist. There's no causality, not in nature, not in events. And maybe causality for someone else, but you have to live in such a way that none of that matters. You have to live as if you are creating the world with every action you do, and choose wisely. So indeed, spoken as a true indeterminist. And I'll just end on one comment. I think you understand what I mean here. When Karl Jaspers read Hannah Arendt's book, The Human Condition, he read it he enjoyed the German translation, Vita Activa. And so he writes to her about his reading experience and says to her, what appeals to me so strongly in this book is that the things you explicitly state, you will not talk about. Right? Indeed, Hannah Arendt says in the beginning, I'm not going to talk about the war, the Holocaust, I'm not going to talk about that. But Jasper says that not talking about it exerts such a palpable influence, he says, from the background. And there's something like that in Salmony too, maybe in an even stronger form, because Salmony does not even state that he's not going to talk about National Socialism, the Holocaust, the evil that he has witnessed in his own life. He doesn't even say it, right? Hannah Arendt does. And so definitely in his case too, there is a palpable influence from the background. And I like to share just this last slide with you. This is a Vermeer, Johannes Vermeer painting. A literary critic spoke about the conspicuous exclusion. And I think that plays a role also in Salmony's lecture on evil. You see, in Vermeer's paintings, you have often a figure that is entirely immersed, serene. Oftentimes a woman, like this woman who is reading a letter, right? And so it looks like it's a perfect world, except that oftentimes there is a map behind that figure, as in this painting, or some other little indication that brings up the political situation of the day. And so Berger writes, the omitted item, like the wars of the time, is not merely missing, but present as missing. It is one thing for an artist merely to omit, but it is another for him to make a point of his omission, directing our attention to it. I believe that Hans-Jörg Alfred Salmony has done precisely that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for questions. Would you like to take questions? Great. All right, folks can remember to unmute themselves when they ask a question.
I see I got some instructions here. Yes, thank you. But I see also, let me go to the beginning. Yeah, this is still part of the instructions. Peter, our dean, has a question here. I wonder if I can say something. Alexander von Falkenhausen headed the occupation of Belgium. He was former head of the German mission to China, actually, and intervened to soften impact. Oh, that's the background. Thank you so much for sharing that. So that explains those refugee trains. Thank you. Yeah, I like assume that somebody must know more about these things. I think that was the only question or comment in the chat room that applied to the lecture.
Okay, anyone else have any questions? Oh, don't raise your hand, just jump in. Yeah. This is Tom Udick today.
Yeah, I was wondering how you feel that Salmony's conception of evil relates to Hannah Arendt's conception of the banality of evil, because he doesn't address it at all. So it never seems to come up, but they're both clearly closely related to Jaspers. Mm-hmm. But it seems to me that they make very different things of, of the philosophical tradition they work in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I started collecting actually names of people around him, and Hannah Arendt obviously was one of them, who all wrote on evil. first teacher in philosophy, Schmalenbach, wrote on evil. The various theologians he had met personally and corresponded with had worked on evil. So that would be kind of like a later stage to find out what is his place in that major conversation that was obviously taking place. But you're right. He doesn't look like he was in any way inspired by Hannah Arendt. And I will tell you now something that will make you smile. But it's like with our parents. We're much later when we cannot ask them questions anymore. We think, stupid me. Why didn't I ask that question, or why didn't I write it down? And now I'm finding I have hundreds of questions I wished I had asked my teacher Salmony. So, and one of them was definitely going to be, so what do you think about Hannah Arendt? I mean, he did mention her, that I know, and always with great respect. But that doesn't say anything about how did he view her like Eichmann in Jerusalem. Would he have agreed with that? I'm not sure. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, folks can just jump in.
Well, I hope.
Well, if no one else does, I'll jump in.
I think Rule were you getting ready?
Yeah. This is kind of actually similar to kind of what Thomas was asking. But you were kind of talking about other figures near him that had been kind of discussing the problem of evil. I know this is in a very different context, but Levinas, also a Jewish philosopher who loses his parents in the Holocaust and family and so forth. He also has some writings on evil that, like, I think in certain ways take a very different approach, but I think there is a similarity. They both seem to kind of dismiss the kind of the theodicy thing. So I was curious if you had thoughts.
Well, as soon as you want to work on evil, I mean, there is 5, 6 earlier philosophers who come very quickly to mind, and definitely Leibniz and obviously Kant, and so not surprisingly, they tapped into the same sources. But it would take really another research to have a better understanding of how he situated himself. You see, I think both consuls mentioned that they hadn't known Salmony's name, and I'm not surprised. Salmony gave up. That's why I quoted for you that passage from a letter to Heinrich Barth. He had given up hope about being accepted as a philosopher, not just being accepted to live in Switzerland. Of course that happened, but he had hopes he could change things, probably at the university, in the way how he would exchange ideas with fellow philosophers. Instead, a series of very bizarre events happened. You see, he wrote his dissertation on Herder, and then the postdoc, which in the German-speaking countries is called the habilitation on Hamann. And Hamann had an influence on Herder. So that was kind of like a good trajectory to go, right? Go from Herder to the person who influenced him. And now you see, that was the 50s. Basel was obviously a very prudish place. I'm not sure, but it still is, but obviously it was a very prudish place in those days. And so he tapped into something that shocked and that was provocative. In his lecture on evil, I mean, he talks about sexuality and sexual deprivation. I'm pretty sure no one else did that at the Venerable University of Basel in the early 60s. That was Salmony, when he felt that that's how it was, and then that's how you should talk about it, right? And so Hamann had this unusual theology that was, let's say, sensual, right? So there was this understanding of the divine creation act being something like a very bodily matter, right? More like when human beings have intercourse. And so he wrote about this and took great risks. And sure enough, he was viciously attacked. People were saying he had a pornographic library in his home, and so that really ruined his reputation. He already had a much harder starting point than other people in philosophy in those days. But with this kind of accusation, he basically decided that, of course, he would continue doing his work as a philosopher and research and write, but he didn't publish anymore. He just didn't publish. But I know now from having seen, comments on the margins of his lectures that he did plan to publish them one day. He died just too early before he could put the last touch-ups. So it is a life that started with a great tragedy, and I wouldn't say it ended with a tragedy. I mean, you heard it, right? Salmony found out how to survive through humor, right? Not irony, not jokes, not sarcasm, right? He found that serenity, that amazing state of mind he was in, that allowed him to continue to do his work. But he was not a public figure. He was not a public figure. That's quite clear. And that's what inspires me to change that. I think he deserves attention. He has been very creative and very brave to spend all his life doing this work, just hoping that somebody might find out about it one day. So I'm definitely committed to people finding out about his philosophy.
There's another question in the chat room, actually.
Yeah, please bring it up. Yeah.
Andrew Wertheimer asks if the reply to Salmony's reply to the problem of evil through humor is a particularly Jewish way of replying to the issue of evil.
I don't know. I love the question. I don't know. He doesn't mention Jewish sources. I mean, except the Bible, right? But you see, sometimes you have things in your family culture, right? And we don't know the kind of conversations were happening in his home. He did have a secular upbringing, but secular or not, I mean, you come from a culture, whatever it may be, Jewish or Hindu. I mean, there are things you grow up with, right? So was that something that influenced him unbeknownst to him? Possibly. By the way, something I didn't talk about at all, and I only found out about it a few years ago because his children generously share some stories with me when I'm in Basel. Salmony's father was born in the United States. And then his parents decided to go back to Germany and so forth. And then when trouble started, he found out that he had no document, he had no certificate of birth to prove that he could actually go to the United States and save his family, himself and his family. So he did go to the American embassy or a consulate. I cannot tell you. I'm not sure whether he went to Berlin or whether he went to a consulate that was closer to Köln. But the American consul he talked to said, well, if you can't prove it, I mean, how are we going to just believe you and so forth? So so his parents stayed in Germany. And then some things are just always odd. I mean, many people, I mean, the Jewish generation of that time couldn't really tell, I mean, who was going to be on a deportation list and not. But it just so happened that his mother, Salmony's mother, was on a deportation list, but not his father. So I suppose his father's mother was not Jewish. So he, according to rabbinic law, he wouldn't have been Jewish. And so he could have presumably just stayed at home or whatever, But what spouse lets his wife or her husband just go to a camp, right? Of course, he went with his wife and perished in Lodz. And then years later, when Salmony was already a professor in Basel, he received a call to teach in the United States. And then there was again something having to do with documents, and he didn't go. I wished, I would have never met him then, but I'm sure he would have had much appreciation in the United States. I met by chance a Haman specialist, and I said, oh, my teacher wrote. Oh, he says, yeah, I know Salmony. So apparently, you cannot be an expert on Haman in the United States, I don't know, elsewhere, without knowing Salmony's book. It was kind of like the book that finally broke the silence and talked about what was really there in Haman's texts. Yeah. Anyway.
If nobody else has questions, could I ask you a question as a historian
Sure.
with very little background in philosophy? First of all, I want to thank you because you walked us through how a philosopher would work and write, and I really appreciated that. That was very helpful for me. I have three questions which you can completely ignore, but I just wanted to get your sense. Going back to earlier in your talk, I thought your comment about the connection between emigration and hope.
Uh-huh.
All right, I can see a lot in that, not just the liminality, but that certainly seems connected to the experiential nature of the final point that you're making, because emigration is a transcendence beyond a particular border, and he, for much of his life, is a man without a state or a government. It's a transcendence beyond being rooted in a particular text. And it really screams to the significance of the wandering Jew. There's a lot of Jewishness in the significance of the Exodus, the most obvious one. So I don't, as a historian at least, I don't know the role of that in philosophy, but a historian interested in German philosophy would ask that. Secondly, as a historian of modern Europe, discussions of determinism, etc., for philosophers might go to Leibniz. For historians, they go to Calvin.
Ah, yes, of course.
And I kept thinking about the significance, particularly Middle Europa, of Calvin, the debates about predestination. Bausman has made the argument that you quoted basically a philosopher made, the lack of anxiety when there is predetermination. Bausman has a very important essay, which I'm sure Karen has read multiple times, about anxiety and predestination. And then thirdly, and I don't want this to be taken the wrong way, but again, as an outsider, there's a kind of irony here in the emphasis on spirit and will, which of course we see in Weber, Spirit of Capitalism, but we also see in Triumph of the Will. There's a kind of ironic marriage here with the emphasis not on structures, not on materialism, but on essence. And Salmony may make the argument that, you know, essence can liberate us. Well, National Socialism made the same argument, that essence and will liberate us. So I find and I don't mean this in a trite or banal way, but I find the essence and the value of spirit as an argument is a kind of ironic marriage, which is leaves me a little disturbed with the argument. Anyhow, thank you very, very much. You don't have to answer any of those. I want to turn it over to the people. They're all asked as a historian, so I'm not really philosophy.
These are very good comments, Peter, and that's the great thing about, you know, having people come to listen to whatever you found out, because there is, you know, chances are that somebody will have a different point of view or will know about some materials, and that's the beauty of it. So that's where the presenter gets to benefit as well. Right, you know, I mean, he may have just remained tacit about some Jewish sources is very possible. I wouldn't know why, but maybe that was part of his hurt, thinking, well, if I now start to talk about that, right? I mean, people are not going to take me as seriously as a philosopher. So I better talk about the complex ideas, the big ideas, right? Kant and definitely Jaspers, with whom he was very close. It is possible. You see, once I get to know more of his lectures, there might be clues here and there. Yeah, so it's possible. And about Calvin, he does discuss Calvin. I didn't bring up Calvin because there was so much to talk about already. I was focusing on what would allow me to show where I think he really became original and found his precise place within indeterminism. And you know, you say spirit, so you and evil, so and will. Do you mean that passage where I said that the will to evil, right, becomes like an eternal recurrence? Is that what prompted your comment? you know, that was something he said about Don Juan, right? So it was not his position, right? He's just trying to understand how that kind of indeterminism works. So it was not his own position. It was just part of his analysis.
Okay,
Yeah.
you and I should have tea when we can all have tea together. Let's have tea because I think there's more. I picked up more. Anyhow, I have some questions though. One of my fine students, thank you, Ms. Colburn, has a question. Do you see it in chat, Tamara?
Okay, I better.
I want everybody to get time. You asked about Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
No, I'm not aware of Salmony having been in any way in touch with Bonhoeffer. You see, so Bonhoeffer was arrested about the time, I think, when Salmony got into Switzerland. So 42 maybe or something, right? And then I know he was in prison for a while and then he was executed. They were not part of the same generation. But would he have read about Bonhoeffer later in life? I don't know. He was, he had an amazing erudition. I mean, I'm shocked when I look at his text and I see the sources. I don't know anyone who works like that nowadays. And sometimes I just have to remind myself that although Salmony lived in the 20th century, his teachers were, of course, trained in the 19th century. You see? And so there is still 19th century culture in the kind of approach he had to texts. Yeah, so I'm pretty sure he would have had a tremendous, you know, respect for Bonhoeffer. He did mention Edith Stein in his lectures, but usually, you know, so in the context of Edmund Husserl, or you would say Husserl in English, because she was Husserl's assistant. But he would always kind of like say a little bit more than that. Yeah. So about Edith Stein, he knew. About Bonhoeffer, I don't recall it. Yeah. Thank you for that question.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? So will you kindly let us know when the talk is published? So
Absolutely.
I could share the citations with folks.
Sure. I'll have to check with the family and, you know, things like that.
No.
Make sure everybody's comfortable. And if I get the green light, I'll let you know.
Okay, because there are a lot of very rich, complex issues here that need reading. All right, very good. Well, thank you all very much for for being with us today. Be safe, be sane, and thank you, Tamara. That was excellent. Thank you very much. Okay, everybody be well. Thank you.